processes. And yet, it's remarkably patterned throughout the world in terms of who it strikes and who dies from it. And in that sense, what we have, some will argue, are the fingerprints of society on the disease itself. That is, disease tends to reveal social fault lines in the society. Fault lines organized by race, and by class, and by sex. And so when one looks at HIV transmission within a given country or across the globe, what one finds is not just an epidemiological rates or epidemiological variations, but what we find are social structures at work. So I'll say that again. When one looks at patterns of HIV transmission, one finds not just epidemiological rates, but really social structures. That is, those epidemiological rates reveal a patterning in the ways in which the disease is spread and who it most affects. And those fault lines are social fault lines. So in terms of class, we know that poor people are disproportionately affected with HIV. Now, it's not the case that things like class or race make anyone particularly more susceptible to HIV than someone who's wealthier, let's say. So it's not the case that wealthy people are less susceptible than poor people to HIV. That's not the issue. The issue, rather, is that wealthy people and poor people are differently located in the social structure in ways that have consequences for HIV transmission. So, as an example, poor people tend to be at greater risk for coming into contact with a person who has HIV, and also engaging in some kind of social or sexual behavior that increases their chances of exposure to the virus, such as injection drug use or unprotected intercourse. Now, what we see globally in rates of HIV is that it settles among the poor, which then begs the question, well, what are the social conditions that might lead to higher HIV rates among the poor rather than the wealthy? If it's not the case that the poor are more biologically susceptible than the wealthy to HIV, then what precisely are the social mechanisms by which HIV disproportionately affects the poor? Well, here's an example. Consider poor women in Africa. Some of these poor women in Africa who don't have many economic opportunities on their own may resort to sex work during difficult economic times as a way to get by. Now, the sex trade in Africa is not regulated, and these women are further at a loss to insist on condom use if they have access to condoms at all. Moreover, because women in Africa tend to be heavily disenfranchised relative to men, that is, they have a lot less power, they're usually less able to insist on condom use, even with boyfriends and husbands. So forgetting about sex work, now we're just talking about relationships. In some places throughout Africa, to ask for condom use is to imply that one is already infected. So there's a lot of stigma around the issue of condom use. So if a woman asks a man in some parts of Africa and in parts of throughout the world to put a condom on, that often comes with the stigma that the woman is promiscuous or unfaithful. So she's less likely to ask for it then. There are other cultural reasons that put African women at risk. So here's another example. There's a sexual practice that used to be quite common. It may be less common now because of HIV and education awareness. But the practice was called dry sex. And the idea here was that in certain cultures in Africa, vaginal fluid was seen to be dirty and unclean. So dry sex was a practice wherein women would insert certain products into their vagina in order to dry the vagina out before penetration. This would include things like salts, antiseptics, talcum powder, newspaper, household detergent, or bleach. Now you can imagine a few consequences of this. One is sex was often incredibly painful for women. And secondly, that this would put women at much greater risk for vaginal tearing and bleeding, thence increased risk for HIV transmission. So here we see how a cultural norm around women's hygiene, combined with women's lack of power to demand safer sex practices, puts them at higher risk for HIV infection. Now, it's not just disease that has social and cultural origins, not just physical disease. It's also mental illnesses. One area of particular strength in the sociology department at University of Toronto is actually studying this link between stress and mental illness. And here, sociologists talk a lot about what they call a stress process model, which I'm going to walk you through right now. Stress process model. So the stress process model is a conceptual tool for thinking about how stress may cause illness. This is a causal flowchart, which means that the arrows suggest lines of causation. You read a flowchart like this from left to right, just like you would read literature, or you read a page of in your text, from left to right. So we start then with job stressors over here, this left box. What this stress process model suggests is that job stressors like the physical environment, interpersonal conflict, job control, employment opportunities, variation in workload, responsibility for people, these things have direct effects. You see those two dark arrows going directly from job stressors to acute reactions. Acute reactions include psychological job dissatisfaction, depression, physiological somatic complaints, and behavioral accidents, substance use, and sickness absence. So this model tells us that job stressors, like those listed in this box, have a direct effect on acute reactions, the things listed in this box. And then acute reactions have a direct effect on illness, such as work-related disability and physician-diagnosed problems. Now, I want to make a few notes here for you. First, this model does not say that job stressors have a direct effect on illnesses. If job stressors were thought to have a direct effect on illnesses, then what you would see in this flowchart is a causal arrow that goes directly from the box of job stressors straight through to illnesses. But you don't see that. What you see is job stressors directly affect or have a direct impact on acute reactions. And then from there, acute reactions have a direct effect on illnesses. Another way to say that is that job stressors affect and bear on illness, but they work through acute reactions to do so. So again, it's not the case that job stressors have a direct effect on illness. Rather, they have an indirect effect. They work through acute reactions. Now, another thing to note, these boxes above and beneath the main figure. So individual factors, age, gender, marital status, job tenure, job title, type A personality, self-esteem, non-work factors, domestic family demands, buffer factors, social support from supervisor, coworkers, and family. These things are postulated to mediate the effect of job stressors on acute reactions. That's why you'll see there are no arrows that go from any of these three boxes to anything else other than the causal arrows themselves. So this particular model does not tell you that non-work factors down here affect job stressors. It does not tell you that non-work factors affect individual factors. It does not tell you that non-work factors affect buffer factors. Why? Because there are no arrows that go directly from non-work factors to any of those things. What this does tell you is that non-work factors, the arrow goes directly to this causal arrow between job stressors and acute reactions. And what that means is that domestic and family demands mediate the effects of job stressor on acute reactions. So here's an example. Let's say you have a high degree of domestic and family demands. Let's say you're a single parent and you have a huge amount of responsibility on your hands. What that means is that if you have a job stressor, like let's say you have interpersonal conflict at work with your boss, the effect of that interpersonal conflict is mediated by your domestic life. If you have a terrific domestic life, then it might be that that interpersonal conflict has less of an impact on acute reactions. That is, your terrific domestic life might weaken the effect of a bad interpersonal conflict on acute reactions. On the other hand, if you have a really bad domestic life, or if you have a huge amount of responsibilities, then any of these factors might have an increased effect on acute reactions. So this is a very kind of dynamic and holistic model that tries to account for many of the different types of factors that mediate between job stressor on the left all the way to illness on the right. Other mediating factors. Buffer factors. So let's say if you have terrific social support from your professor, which of course you do. A professor as caring and supportive and smart as Dr. Green means that any possible job stressors that you have will be weakened. Their effect will not be as strong on acute reactions because of the tremendous support, guidance, and wisdom that Dr. Green offers. Now, on the other hand, Professor Brin, who's evil, a bad professor in your life that gives you a lot of trouble might then make that interpersonal conflict you have at work even worse. It doesn't have a buffering effect. All right, I'm going to say, okay, so now let's go to individual factors up here. How do these influence the job stressors? Well, you see again, the only arrow from individual factors to anything else in the model is to the causal arrows directly from job stressor to acute reactions. So this model is not hypothesizing any connection between individual factors and anything else other than it will have a mediating effect on the causal impact of job stressors on acute reactions. So, as an example, self-esteem is an individual level factor. If you have very high levels of self-esteem, then the job conflict that you have may not really have as big of an effect on acute reactions. If you have very low self-esteem, then you can imagine if you have a bad conflict at work, it makes these acute reactions even worse. So again, individual level factors up here and down here, non-work factors and buffer factors. These are all mediating factors that shape the relationship or the impact of job stressors on acute reactions. So to say one more time, basically the stress process model, this particular model, is looking at job stressors, and it's trying to conceptualize the relationship of job stress on the left all the way over here to illness. And what this figure tells you is that there is an impact, it's just not direct. The effect of job stress on illness exists as conceptualized here, but it works through acute reactions. It doesn't have a direct effect, but rather an indirect effect on illness. Okay, so this model also clearly tells you that social conditions affect health and well-being and affect illness. So things like stressors in your job, or stressors around your domestic life, or stressors at school, those kinds of things can work individually and collectively to produce negative effects, negative psychological effects, and ultimately negative physical effects. So the social does matter in shaping medical outcomes, both for mental illness and physical illness. Now, other factors that are commonly put into stress process models that are not here, things like racism, sexism, homophobia, all of those things can act as sources of stress. They can produce anxiety, depression, feelings of hopelessness. And those feelings themselves can cause bad health. Okay, but by far in the literature, what we find over and over again with amazing consistency is that the greatest social determinant of health, is class status. And what do we mean by class status? We mean basically the combined factors of your income and your educational status. If you take income and you combine it with educational status, you get what we call SES, or socioeconomic status. And by far, in all of the research that's done internationally, socioeconomic status has the most significant impact on health outcomes. Study after study tells us that working class and poor people have more disease and they die at a younger age compared to their wealthier counterparts. So this is another way of saying class inequality equals health inequality. Even more interesting, as class inequality has grown over time in North America, that is, as the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and there's a bigger distinction between the rich and the poor, as differences between what a CEO gets paid and what an entry-level worker gets paid, as those differences widen, which they have over time, so do these health disparities between rich and poor. Okay, so here's an example in Canada and the US. Rates of mortality among working-age men correlated with income of the less well-off half of households. And what you can see here is that as the median share of income increases, so if you look to the bottom of this figure and you move to the right, this shows the share of the income as it increases across people. As the share of income increases, what happens? This here, rate of mortality among working-age men, falls off. So this is a pretty staggering, linear, almost a linear kind of relationship between income and mortality. And it's very interesting to note that it's not just like dichotomous differences, like differences between very wealthy and very poor. That's not what this is showing. This is showing an actual gradient, a nuanced relationship between decreasing wealth and increasing mortality. So like, you could almost say, and we can't from this particular figure because we don't have the exact data, but you can almost say that with every few $1,000s of increase a person earns, and every few more years of education they have, they live longer. So we're not talking about just differences between like someone that has a high school degree and someone that has a PhD. We're talking about all of the gradations within that lead to noticeable differences in health. Okay. attacks are interesting. Heart attacks are one of the ways in which we can gain a window into the effects of class on health. Now, there are certain risk factors, probably many of you know them, for heart attack. So things like smoking, poor diet, sitting around the couch eating Cheetos all day, I know you folks do that. Obesity, hypertension, high cholesterol, stress. All of these things tend to increase one's chance of heart attack. And they are all more common among the less educated and the less affluent. They are all more common, those risk factors, among the less educated and less affluent. Now, those who are less affluent and less educated are also less likely to receive cardiopulmonary resuscitation. They're less likely to get to the emergency room in time to affect the heart attack. And they are also less likely to adhere to lifestyle changes after the heart attack. Lifestyle changes like maybe taking up yoga, or working a little bit less, or what have you, quitting smoking. So across the board, whether it's the lifestyle factors prior to the heart attack, whether it's actually receiving proper care and timely care, or whether it's after the heart attack, the ability to change one's lifestyle and improve one's health. All of those things are harder to do and less common among those who are worse off. So to make this really concrete, there's this little New York Times piece that I want to turn to now. It's kind of like a video of the case of two people who have heart attacks. Both of them live in New York, and both of them had the heart attack around the same time. One is a man, one is a woman. Now what's interesting here is that even though they're about the same age, they live in the same city, they both have a heart attack around the same time, the major difference here is that one person is quite well off, while the second person is rather poor. So let's see what the New York Times can tell us about this. I don't know if I'm high broadband or what.
I picked up some colleagues, and we went home to have a great sushi lunch. We probably spent $100. We got out of the restaurant, and this beautiful young attorney turned around to me and said, "Are you okay, Gene?" And I said, "No."
It was Sunday, I remember. I'm working. I came home. I think that I eat something. We play cards, but I get heart attack. I don't know, maybe 7 o'clock evening. My name is Iva Renchak Gora. I'm from the Poland. I'm working in Hotel Esplanade. This is hotel for old people, very rich old people.
My parents named me Gene Mealy. I wanted to be an architect from the time I was a little kid, largely because my dad was an architect. The doctors had told me that I should have lost 15 or 20 pounds. I pretty much paid no attention to them.
I know that I eat no good, but when doctor told me, Eva, you have to be careful, I think, how you know? Not me. And I get, because I know, listen, doctor. I'm thinking that my blood pressure is high. And I take pills for blood pressure. And after maybe 20 minutes, it's not stop. So I have still pain. And my husband called to hospital. They come in. I was sure they give me only injection for my blood pressure. They decide that I have to go to the hospital. They don't say me that this is heart attack.
there was a gurney waiting outside the ER and people waiting outside. They transferred me from one gurney to the other gurney, wheeled me into the emergency room. So we're talking about now 7 minutes from the time that I had chest pains, and put me in an elevator and set me up to the catheterization room. I was in a lot of pain, and that's when I flatlined. It goes from beep, 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 beep to beep. I think all they had to do was push a button, and my heart turned back on again. I looked and I actually saw the catheter going up into this small artery. He blew up the balloon that was holding the stent. When he collapsed the balloon, all the pain stopped.
I think that when I have heart attack, they should make me angiogram. When they make me angiogram, they see that my heart is blocked. They should unblockade. They don't did me this because I am a very small person, nothing. No. After steps, because I am tired after steps, my heart is tired. Before heart attack, we make exercise for 1 hour. Now it's impossible. It's too much for me. I'm tired. Absolutely different person than before. I have to little bit rest. You know.
I can now take the subway steps 2 at a time. I couldn't do that before. The real main change is organized exercise. My surgeon recommended that I attend cardiac rehab classes to begin with. They may have been intense for me, but they would have been ridiculous to the average individual as being, inconsequential.
I know that I can dance large because I scared. I can drink because I scared. I am absolutely different person. I'm thinking about it. I remember that I had heart attack.
So far, it has had an extremely positive effect on my life. It's not even a small positive effect. It's had an extremely positive effect. The fact is that how I have reacted to my own situation is very carefully considered. Part of it relates to the fact that I can work from home, where I can change my life. Another person may not do that, and that doesn't have to do with luck. That has to do with the other person's life, and it has to do with their attitude towards life. I really actually think that I probably will die of something else rather than another recurring heart attack. I hope I don't even remember it 10 years from now, to be very honest with you.
I think that all the time we the same like now. I not believe that be better. My memory still remember what I had. I never be better. I think like that, and maybe, I don't know.